The aroma of grilling burgers and sweet blooming lilacs hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the sudden chill that settled over me. It all began so perfectly, a picture postcard Saturday afternoon in Millbrook, nestled in the rolling hills of upstate New York. Our neighbour, Mrs. Parson, known for her extravagant summer kickoff parties, had outdone herself this year. Fairy lights twinkled in the trees, a local band played softly in the background, and the laughter of friends and neighbours filled the air. It was the kind of day that promised happiness, the kind of day that should have been etched in my memory as a joyful celebration. Instead, it became the day my life imploded. I was surrounded by my closest friends, a group of women I'd shared countless secrets, dreams, and bottles of wine with. We were clustered near the mimosa bar, glasses of chilled rosé in hand, the conversation light and bubbly, just like the drinks. Ethan, my husband, was manning the grill, his brow furrowed in concentration as he expertly flipped burgers, his occasional smile a beacon of warmth in the gathering dusk. He caught my eye and grinned, that same boyish, heart-stopping grin that had first drawn me to him 5 years ago, back when we were just naive college kids, full of dreams and promises. In that moment, a pang of guilt twisted in my stomach. I should have gone over to him, thanked him for taking charge of the grilling, for always being so thoughtful, so willing to please. Instead, fueled by a strange need for validation from my friends, I launched into yet another story, another anecdote designed to paint me as the effortlessly charming wife with the hopelessly devoted husband. "You guys will not believe what Ethan did the other day," I began, my voice laced with a faux exasperation that now makes me cringe with self-loathing. I casually mentioned, and I mean casually, that I was craving sushi from that place in the city, you know, the one that's impossible to get a reservation at. Well, the next day, surprise. Ethan had not only secured a table, but he'd pulled some serious strings with a client, a very important client, I might add, just to make it happen. I paused, allowing my friends' envious gasps to wash over me. But I wasn't finished. The need to embellish, to exaggerate, to further solidify my position as the enviable wife took hold. "And here's the kicker," I continued, a smug smile playing on my lips. When we got there, I suddenly decided I wasn't in the mood for sushi anymore. I wanted Italian. And you know what? Ethan, bless his heart, just smiled, cancelled the reservation, the impossible reservation, mind you, and took me to that tiny trattoria down the street. Didn't even complain. I laughed, shaking my head, playing the role of the exasperated, yet adored wife to perfection. I swear that man would bend himself into a pretzel if I asked him to. Sometimes I wonder if he has a backbone at all. The laughter that followed my words was sharp, brittle, and short-lived. A sudden, heavy silence descended, a silence that prickled with unease. I turned, my heart plummeting to my stomach, to see Ethan standing a few feet away, his face pale, his eyes devoid of the warmth I so carelessly took for granted. He held a plate piled high with perfectly grilled burgers, the aroma of charred meat and smoky charcoal, a cruel mockery of the idyllic scene that had just played out. I opened my mouth to speak, to apologize, to explain, but he cut me off with a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low and controlled, a voice I barely recognized. He led me away from the party, past the laughing guests, past the twinkling lights, past the normalcy I had so carelessly shattered. I could feel the weight of their gazes, the unspoken questions hanging heavy in the air. My cheeks burned with shame, yet a part of me, a small, stubborn part, clung to the hope that this was just a momentary blip, a misunderstanding that would quickly be resolved. Ethan, after all, had always forgiven me. But as we reached the far end of Mrs. Parsons' meticulously manicured lawn, shielded from view by a towering hedge of rose bushes, I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this time was different. He set the plate of burgers down on a nearby table, the clink of ceramic against wood echoing in the sudden stillness. He turned to face me, his usually warm brown eyes now cold and distant, like a shuttered window. "I'm done, Olivia," he said, his voice barely a whisper, each word a dagger to my heart. "I'm done being your punching bag, your joke, your doormat. I'm done being disrespected by you and everyone else because you've made it abundantly clear that I'm not worthy of respect." His words hit me with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping for breath in the suffocating silence. I stumbled back, shaking my head in denial, the carefully constructed facade of my perfect life crumbling around me. "It was just a joke. You know I didn't mean to humiliate you in front of our friends, or make you feel less than..." My voice trailed off, the words choked by a rising tide of panic and regret. "Then a man, or take advantage of my love for you. I'm sorry, Ethan. Please, I'm sorry. Olivia, you've never considered how your actions affect others, including me." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as a sign of deep frustration. "I've put up with it for years, thinking that if I just loved you enough, if I just tried harder, you'd see me. Really see me. But you don't. But..." I reached out to touch his arm, but he flinched away. The action sent a spike of pain through my heart. "Ethan, I do see you. I love you. Please, let's just go home and talk about this." He shook his head, a bitter look on his face. He smiled, but it was a twisted, painful smile. "Olivia," he said, his voice flat, "I'm leaving. When you get home, your things will be packed and waiting for you on the porch. I don't want you in the house anymore." The finality in his voice sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't like our usual arguments, where I could persuade him to change his mind, or where he would eventually give in to keep the peace. This was different. This was the end. "You can't be serious," I said, my voice rising in panic. "Ethan, this is our home, our life. You can't just throw it all away over one stupid comment." "It's not just one comment, Olivia. It's years of comments, years of disrespect, years of me giving everything I have to this relationship while you take and take and take." He looked at me, and the pain in his eyes made my breath catch. "I love you, Olivia. God help me, I probably always will. But I can't do this anymore. I won't." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone amongst Mrs. Parsons' hydrangeas. The sounds of the party, the laughter, the music, were a stark contrast to the turmoil raging inside me. I watched him make his way through the crowd, stopping briefly to say goodbye to our hosts before disappearing down the street towards our house. Our house! That thought jolted me into action. I hurried after him, ignoring the curious stares and whispered comments from our neighbours. By the time I reached our home, a quaint 2-story colonial we'd bought just a year ago, I was breathless and trembling. Ethan was already inside. I burst through the front door, calling his name. The sight that greeted me stopped me in my tracks. Ethan was in the living room, methodically packing my clothes into suitcases. "Ethan!" I pleaded, moving to grab the shirt he was folding. "Please, let's just talk." He shot me a look and pulled the shirt away from me, his jaw tight. "Olivia, I've made my decision." "But you can't just kick me out." I was desperate, the panic clawing at my throat. "This is my home too." He paused in his packing to look at me, his expression hard. "Actually, it's not. The house is in my name, as you remember. You wanted to avoid a mortgage because you didn't want to be tied down." That conversation came back to me with painful clarity. I had pushed for Ethan to buy the house on his own, saying it would be better for our finances. In reality, I thought it would be an easy way out if things ever got tough. I never imagined it would backfire on me like this. "Ethan, please," I begged, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry. I'll do better. I'll change. Just give me another chance." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but then he shook his head, his resolve hardening. "Olivia, I've given you chances. More chances than I should have. It's too late now." He finished packing my clothes and moved on to my personal items. I watched helplessly as he efficiently packed away my life, occasionally asking me where I wanted certain things. The surreal nature of the situation made me feel like I was watching a movie of someone else's life falling apart. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our once happy home, Ethan carried the last of my suitcases to the front porch. I stood in the doorway, feeling utterly lost and alone, the weight of my actions finally crushing me. I felt lost and small. Where am I supposed to go? I barely whispered the question. Ethan was running a hand over his face. For the first time, I noticed how tired he looked. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper than I remembered. "Call your parents," he said, his voice weary. "Or one of your friends. I don't know, but you can't stay here." "What about us?" I asked, clinging to the last shred of hope. "Is this really it?" He looked at me, then looked away, and I saw a lifetime of love and pain reflected in his eyes. "Yeah, Olivia," he said quietly. "This is really it. I'll have my lawyer drop the divorce papers off next week." He led me, gently but firmly, onto the porch and closed the door. I heard the lock click into place with a chilling finality. I sank down onto the porch steps, surrounded by my hastily packed life, and let the tears flow freely. I was overwhelmed by the weight of my actions, hit by the full force of the consequences of years of thoughtlessness and disrespect. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called my dad. "Dad," I choked out when he answered. "I've made a terrible mistake. I need you to come get me." The next few days passed in a blur of shame and regret. My parents greeted me with open arms, but I could see the disappointment in their eyes. They had always adored Ethan, viewing him as the son they never had. As I recounted the events that led to our separation, I could see them struggling to understand how I could have treated someone they considered family so poorly. I spent most of my time in my childhood bedroom, alternating between crying into my pillow and staring blankly at the walls. The cheerful yellow paint and faded posters from my teenage years seemed to mock me. I was flooded with messages from friends who'd heard about what happened at the barbecue. Most were concerned and curious, eager for the juicy details of my marital breakdown. A few, like my supposed best friend, Alexis, were more sympathetic, offering words of support and promises to be there for me. But as the days wore on, and the reality of my situation sank in, I began to see these friendships for what they truly were: shallow connections, built on gossip and mutual self-interest. I was utterly alone in my misery. None of them truly cared about me or my pain. They were just happy to have some fresh drama to discuss over their morning coffee. I overheard my parents talking in hushed tones one day, when I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. "I just don't understand how she could have been so thoughtless," my mother said, her voice laced with sadness. "We raised her better than that." My father sighed. "I know, dear, but Olivia's always been, well, you know how she is, always wanting to be the center of attention, never really thinking about how her actions affect others." "But Ethan," my mother replied, her voice trailing off. I could hear the tears in her voice. "He was so good to her, so patient." She recalled how he used to bring her breakfast in bed every Sunday, or how he'd surprise her with little gifts for no reason at all. "He loved her more than anything," my father said softly, but she threw it all away. I retreated back to my room, their words ringing in my ears. For the first time, I started to see myself through other people's eyes. The image wasn't flattering. That night, I couldn't sleep. I decided to do something I should have done days ago. I opened my laptop and started a new document. At the top, I typed, "Ways I hurt Ethan." As I began to write, I thought about all the times I had taken him for granted, all the times I had belittled him, ignored his feelings, dismissed his needs, and put my own desires above his. The document grew longer and longer. By the time the first rays of dawn began to peek through my curtains, I had filled page after page with my transgressions. Reading through the list was like a punch to the gut. How had I become this person? How had I allowed myself to treat someone I claimed to love with such disregard? I was shaking as I reached for my phone. It was early, but I couldn't wait any longer. I needed to apologize to Ethan, to beg for his forgiveness. But when I pulled up his contact, my thumb hovering over the call button, I hesitated. What right did I have to disturb his peace, to force him to confront the pain I had caused? What would I even say? In that moment, I realized I wanted to ease my own guilt, to make myself feel better. But what about what Ethan needed? I put my phone down. For once in my life, I decided to put someone else's needs before my own. If Ethan wanted space, I would give him space. If he wanted to move on without me, as much as it hurt, I would respect his decision. Instead, I opened my laptop again and started a new document. This time, I titled it, How to Become a Better Person. It was time for me to do the hard work of self-reflection and personal growth, not for Ethan, but for myself. I never wanted to be the kind of person who could hurt someone they loved ever again. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Life went on, as it tends to do, even when you feel like your world has stopped turning. I stayed at my parents' house, slowly putting the pieces of my life back together. The divorce proceedings were quick and straightforward. Ethan was a gentleman and didn't fight me on anything. He even agreed to a small settlement, despite my contributing little financially to our marriage. He was kind, even in the face of our separation. I got a job at a local marketing firm, an entry-level position. It wasn't glamorous work, mostly data entry and coffee runs, but it was a start. It was the first time in my adult life that I was supporting myself, learning the value of hard work and the satisfaction of earning my own money. My social life, which had once been the center of my world, dwindled to almost nothing. Most of my so-called friends drifted away once they realized I was no longer a source of gossip or entertainment. Alexis stuck around for a while, but even she eventually stopped calling when it became clear that I was no longer interested in our old lifestyle of parties and mindless chatter. The silence and solitude were a stark contrast to my previous life, but it was exactly what I needed. I began the hard work of self-improvement. I read self-help books and started journaling. I even began seeing a therapist to work through my issues. Dr. Larson, my therapist, was a kind but no-nonsense woman in her 50s. In our sessions, she helped me unpack years of selfish behavior and skewed perceptions. "Olivia," she said during one particularly difficult session, "have you ever considered why you felt the need to belittle Ethan in front of your friends?" I shrugged, picking at a loose thread on the arm of the chair. "I guess I thought it made me look good, like I had this great guy who would do anything for me." I paused. "I was amazed that he put up with it." Dr. Larson nodded thoughtfully. "And how do you think that made Ethan feel?" The question hit me like a ton of bricks. Maybe for the first time in my life, I truly thought about what it must have been like to be in Ethan's position. I imagined how it must feel to be the subject of constant jokes, to have your love and devotion mocked and taken for granted. "Horrible," I said quietly, tears welling in my eyes. "It must have made him feel so small and worthless." "Exactly," Dr. Larson said gently. "Olivia, true love isn't about power or control. It's about respect, empathy, and genuine appreciation for your partner. It's about seeing them, truly seeing them, and valuing them for who they are." Her words resonated deeply within me, a seed of understanding finally taking root in the barren landscape of my self-absorption. I still had a long way to go, but I knew, with a newfound clarity, that I was finally on the right path. True love isn't about control. It's about showing mutual respect, support, and kindness. It's about lifting each other up, not tearing each other down. Her words stayed with me long after the session ended. I began to see all my past relationships, not just with Ethan, but with friends and family as well, in a new light. I realized how often I had prioritized my own needs and desires over everyone else's. How often I had used people for my own gain, without considering their feelings. It was a painful realization, but a necessary one. I knew that if I ever wanted to have healthy relationships in the future, I needed to make some serious changes. One day, about 6 months after the fateful barbecue, I ran into Mrs. Parson at the local grocery store. I had been avoiding her, and most of our old neighbours, too ashamed to face them after the way things had ended with Ethan. But there was no escaping the kind lady. She spotted me in the produce aisle and called out, "Olivia, dear, how are you?" I forced a smile, bracing myself for the awkward conversation ahead. "Hello, Mrs. Parson. I'm doing okay. How are you?" I was surprised to see her face soften with genuine concern. She reached out and touched my arm. "I've been worried about you, honey. We all have." Her kindness, so unexpected, brought tears to my eyes. "I'm sorry," I mumbled, hastily wiping at my cheeks. I've made such a mess of everything." Mrs. Parson glanced around the store, then guided me towards a quiet corner. "Listen, Olivia," she said in a low, kind voice. "We all make mistakes. Lord knows I've made my fair share. The important thing is that we learn from them." I nodded, unable to speak. "Have you talked to Ethan recently?" she asked carefully. I shook my head. "No, I've been giving him space. I don't think he wants to hear from me." Mrs. Parson smiled faintly. "You might be surprised, dear. Ethan's been asking about you." My heart skipped a beat. "He has?" Mrs. Parson nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Ethan always thinks of others, even when they don't deserve it." "I don't deserve his concern," I said softly. Mrs. Parson clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "We all deserve compassion, Olivia, even when we've made mistakes." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook and pen, quickly scribbling something. She tore off the page and handed it to me. "This is Ethan's new number," she said. "He changed it a while back. I think he'd appreciate hearing from you." I stared at the number, my heart racing. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. Mrs. Parson squeezed my arm gently. "You don't have to decide right now. Just think about it." I nodded, carefully folding the paper and tucking it into my pocket. As Mrs. Parson said goodbye and continued with her shopping, I stood there, feeling as if the world had shifted on its axis. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the piece of paper with Ethan's number. My phone lay beside me, silent and accusing. I picked it up, my fingers hovering over the keypad. What would I even say? How do you even begin to apologize for years of thoughtlessness and disrespect? How do you ask forgiveness from someone you've hurt so deeply? In the end, I decided on a text. It felt cowardly, but I knew if I heard his voice, I might lose my nerve completely. "Ethan," I typed. "If you don't respond, I understand. I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what happened at the barbecue, but also for everything. I'm sorry for taking you for granted and making you feel less than the amazing person you are. You deserve so much better. I'm truly, deeply sorry for the pain I caused you. I hope you're doing well and finding happiness. You deserve it." I hesitated, then added one more line. "I'm working on becoming a better person. I have a long way to go, but I'm trying." I took a deep breath and hit send. Then I waited. That I'm a bit of a hothead. I've been known to throw my phone across the room when I'm angry. That night was one of those moments. My heart was pounding, and I felt slightly nauseous. What had I done? I paced my room, staring at my phone, waiting for a response. But as the night wore on and there was no message, I started to accept that maybe I'd gone too far, that Ethan had moved on. And as much as it hurt, I wanted him to be happy, even if it meant a life without me in it. Just as I was about to give up, my phone lit up with a new message. I opened it with trembling hands. "Olivia," it read. "Thank you for your message. It means a lot to hear that from you. I hope you're doing well too. Take care." It wasn't much, but it was something. A small olive branch extended between us. As I lay in bed that night, I felt a glimmer of something I hadn't experienced in months. Hope. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work, therapy sessions, and quiet nights at home. I threw myself into self-improvement. I started volunteering at a local animal shelter, finding joy in caring for creatures who didn't ask for anything in return. I also started yoga and meditation, which helped me quiet the constant chatter in my mind and find a sense of peace and stillness. Ethan and I exchanged a few more text messages. While they were cordial, they were also distant. We didn't discuss getting back together, or even meeting in person. It was clear that while he no longer harbored any anger towards me, the trust between us had been broken. It would take time, maybe a long time, to rebuild, if it was even possible. It was during this time that I ran into Sarah, an old acquaintance from the neighborhood. I'd never been close to her. My friend Alexis had some sort of issue with her. But now, free from the negative influence of my former friends, I actually enjoyed Sarah's company. We met for coffee one afternoon, and as we chatted, Sarah filled me in on the latest neighborhood news. I listened with interest, but also a sense of detachment. I realized how much my life had changed in the past few months. The small dramas that used to consume my time now seemed trivial and unimportant. "And here's something else," Sarah said, leaning in conspiratorially. "You know your ex?" I nodded, feeling a sense of unease. "I heard they've all been trying to get with him," Sarah said, her eyes wide. "Can you believe it? The same women who used to laugh at your jokes about him are now falling all over themselves to catch his attention." I was taken aback, feeling a confusing mix of emotions. Anger at my former friend's disloyalty, jealousy that Ethan might be moving on, and a deep sadness for the relationships I had destroyed. "Has he shown interest in any of them?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Sarah shook her head. "Not that I know of. He's been keeping to himself mostly, focuses on his work and goes to the gym a lot." I nodded, a small smile playing on my lips despite the pain in my heart. It sounded like Ethan was using this adversity as an opportunity for personal growth too. "You know," Sarah said softly, reaching out to touch my hand, "I never really understood why you and Ethan weren't closer before. I always thought you seemed nice, underneath all the drama." "You mean selfishness?" I offered, a self-deprecating smile touching my lips. Sarah smiled sympathetically. "We all have our moments, Olivia. The important thing is that you're trying to be better now. That counts for a lot in my book." Her words warmed me. After a long time, I finally felt like I was making a genuine connection, a real friend. As the months went by, I started to settle into a new way of living. My job at the marketing company had become more challenging, and I was doing well. My relationship with my parents was better than ever, as they could see the changes I was making in my life. My friendship with Sarah had also blossomed into something truly special. Despite all the positive changes, though, there was still an Ethan-shaped hole in my heart. I missed him with an ache that never quite went away. It was on a crisp autumn day, almost a year after our separation, that I ran into Ethan for the first time since that fateful barbecue. I was leaving my favorite coffee shop, a stack of files tucked under one arm and a latte in my free hand, when I bumped into someone. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I exclaimed, trying to balance my coffee and keep my files from spilling everywhere. I looked up and saw familiar, warm brown eyes. "Olivia," Ethan breathed, his voice soft and uncertain. "Ethan," I replied, feeling as if all the air had been sucked out of my lungs. "Here, let me help you with that," he said, reaching out and steadying my coffee cup. His fingers brushed against mine for a brief moment, sending a jolt through my system. "Thanks," I said, my heart pounding. "How are you?" Ethan smiled, and I was struck by how good he looked. He'd always been handsome, but now there was a confidence about him that was undeniably attractive. "I'm doing well," he said. "How about you? Sarah mentioned you've been working at Millbrook Marketing." The fact that he knew this, that he'd asked about me, made my pulse quicken. "Yes, I have," I replied. "It's been challenging, but in a good way. I'm learning a lot." Ethan nodded approvingly. "That's great, Olivia. I'm happy for you." An awkward silence fell between us. There was so much I wanted to say, so many apologies I wanted to make, but the words stuck in my throat. "Listen," he said finally, running a hand through his hair in that familiar gesture of nervousness. "Would you... I'd love to catch up sometime." I was surprised by the offer. It took me back to our college days, when we'd spend hours in coffee shops, talking about everything and nothing. But we weren't those carefree kids anymore. We were two adults with a painful history between us. "Are you sure?" I asked hesitantly. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." Ethan's smile was gentle. "I think it might be good for us to talk." With butterflies in my stomach and hope blooming in my chest, I followed Ethan back into the coffee shop. We sat down in a quiet corner booth, our hands wrapped around steaming mugs. For a few moments we sat in silence, the weight of our shared history hanging heavy between us. "Have you really been working on yourself, Olivia?" Ethan began, his voice soft but steady. I took a deep breath, deciding in that moment to be completely honest. "It's been hard," I admitted. "Losing you, hearing how I'd messed up. It was like waking up from a long, selfish dream. But it's also been eye-opening. I've learned a lot about myself and the kind of person I want to be." Ethan nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I'm glad to hear that. You seem different, more grounded." "I'm trying to be," I said. "I've been seeing a therapist, Dr. Larson. She's been helping me work through a lot of my issues." "That's great, Olivia," Ethan said, and I could hear the sincerity in his voice. "I'm proud of you for taking that step." His words brought tears to my eyes. "Thank you," I whispered. "Ethan, I am so sorry for everything. I know I said it before, but I need you to know how deeply I regret the way I treated you. You deserved so much better." Hearing you say that. He paused, nodding, a small smile playing on his lips. It means a lot. It hasn't been easy. It took a lot of time, and my own therapy sessions, but I've come to a place where I can honestly say I forgive you. Holding on to that anger and hurt wasn't good for me. I felt as if a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. "Thank you," I said, my voice choked with emotion. "That means more to me than you know." We talked for a long time that day, not about the past, but about the present and the future. There were no promises made, no grand declarations of rekindled love. But as I left the coffee shop, stepping back into the crisp autumn air, I felt a sense of lightness and hope I hadn't felt in a very long time. The Ethan-shaped hole in my heart was still there, but now, a tiny seed of possibility had been planted. And maybe, just maybe, with time, care, and a lot of hard work, something beautiful could grow from the wreckage of our past. Me than you know. We spent the next hour catching up and sharing stories. We chatted about our lives over the past year. Ethan told me about his promotion at work, his newfound passion for rock climbing, and the stray cat he'd adopted. I told him about my job, my volunteer work at the animal shelter, and my friendship with Sarah. As our conversation drew to a close, I felt a bittersweet ache in my chest. It had been so good to talk to Ethan again, to laugh with him and share our lives. But I knew that this didn't mean we were getting back together. We'd both been through a lot, and we had broken each other's trust. It would take time and a lot of work to rebuild that, if it was even possible. "It was nice to catch up, Olivia," Ethan said as we stood to leave. "It was," I agreed, smiling through the tears that threatened to fall. "Ethan, I know things can never go back to how they were before, but do you think we could maybe be friends?" Ethan was quiet for a moment, considering. Then he smiled, that warm, genuine smile that had always made my heart skip a beat. "I'd like that, Olivia. I think we could try." As we said our goodbyes and went our separate ways, I felt a mix of emotions swirling within me. Sadness for what we had lost, joy for this new beginning, and a fragile hope for what the future might hold. Walking home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in just 1 year. I had lost so much: my marriage, my friends, and my sense of self. But in losing those things, I had gained something far more valuable: self-awareness. I knew I still had a lot of work to do to become a better person. I knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Building a friendship with Ethan would require patience, understanding, and a level of emotional maturity that I was still developing. There would be awkward moments, painful reminders of our past, and the constant temptation to hope for more. I had made mistakes, big mistakes. I had hurt people I loved and taken for granted the good things in my life. But I had also learned from those mistakes. I had faced the ugly parts of myself and committed to change. And in doing so, I had discovered a strength within myself that I never knew existed. As I reached the front door of my apartment, an apartment I paid for with my own hard-earned money, I paused to look back at the path that had led me here. I felt grateful for the lessons, even though they had been painful. I was grateful for the people who had stood by me, even when I didn't deserve it. And I was grateful for second chances, not just with Ethan, but with myself. I kicked off my shoes and went inside. As I drifted off to sleep that night, I made a promise to myself. I promised never to take the people in my life for granted again. I promised to always try to be better, kinder, more understanding, and most importantly, to love myself enough to never settle for being less than my best self.